What set off the angry political debates that influenced early America? From the late 1700s into the early 1800s, the United States struggled to define the balance of federal power, the place of tariffs, and its ties to European nations. These disputes gave rise to two main parties: the Federalists, who favored a strong central government and closer connections with Britain, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who advocated states' rights and showed sympathy toward France. Over time, each significant event pushed them further apart, shaping the new republic's political identity. Well before Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, the Judiciary Act of 1801, often called the Midnight Judges Act, revealed the partisan tensions that would define his administration. Passed by the departing Federalist-controlled Congress under John Adams, it created new judicial positions that the Federalists filled at the last minute. Jeffersonian Republicans saw these appointments as an attempt to cement Federalist influence in the courts. Once Jefferson took office, he and his allies worked to repeal the act, intensifying hostilities with Federalists who insisted they were preserving judicial stability. At the same time, conflicts with the Barbary states tested Jefferson's commitment to a smaller government and limited military spending. North African rulers demanded tribute from American merchant ships, and when Jefferson refused, they seized U.S. vessels. Federalists argued this proved the need for a robust navy, whereas Democratic Republicans debated whether such measures clashed with their preference for reduced federal expenditures. Although these Barbary Wars did not equal the scale of European conflicts, they underscored America's broader challenge of protecting trade without forsaking its founding principles. Shortly after, territorial expansion reshaped national priorities. In 1803, Jefferson orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size. He then sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to map the region, and their journals highlighted abundant resources and new diplomatic ties with native tribes. Federalists worried new Western states would dilute Eastern influence, while Democratic Republicans, who championed agrarian values, saw fertile farmland as validation of their vision. Reports in the Missouri Gazette and letters from fur traders like Manuel Lisa confirmed the rapid inflow of settlers, showing that westward growth was no abstract theory. Meanwhile, debates over slavery intensified. In 1807, Congress passed the Act Prohibiting the Importation of Slaves, effective in 1808. Jefferson, despite his own complex relationship with slavery, supported this legislation in principle, reflecting mounting pressure from certain states and reformers. Critics claimed it could harm Southern economies reliant on enslaved labor, while supporters considered it a moral imperative. Smuggling persisted, but the measure symbolized growing friction that would later erupt when new territories decided whether to allow slavery. In the same year, Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807 to protect American ships from British and French interference by banning foreign trade altogether. Salem merchant William Gray recorded in his account books how this policy left ships idle and workers unpaid. A Boston newspaper condemned the embargo as an unfair cage around honest traders. Jefferson privately admitted to James Madison that the policy was difficult to sustain, but some thought it necessary to avert war. He replaced it in 1809 with the Non-Intercourse Act, restricting trade only with Britain and France. This led to Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810, which reopened commerce but promised that if either Britain or France respected American neutrality, sanctions would be revived against the other. Napoleon pretended to comply, while Britain did not, fueling anti-British sentiment and driving the nation closer to the War of 1812. Mounting tensions then culminated in armed conflict, further splitting Federalists and Democratic Republicans. After the war, British goods flooded American markets, threatening emerging industries. In response, Congress enacted the Tariff of 1816 to protect domestic factories. Jefferson wrote to Treasury Secretary Alexander Dallas requesting an exemption for French wines, illustrating the tariff's intrusion into personal preferences. Many Federalists, recalling Alexander Hamilton's industrial vision, praised the measure. Democratic Republicans warned it would raise consumer costs. Records from the Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania document increased profits and hiring once the tariff shield took effect, while the Richmond Enquirer denounced it as a scheme to enrich manufacturers at the expense of the plow. Simultaneously, internal improvements became a new frontier of debate. Calls to construct roads, canals, and other public works arose from leaders who recognized that economic development and national unity required better infrastructure. For instance, Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin presented his 1808 report on roads, canals, harbors, and rivers, proposing a federal plan to link the states through a network of improved transportation routes. Federalists generally supported such proposals, arguing they promoted efficiency and commercial progress. Some strict constructionist Democratic Republicans countered that the Constitution did not grant this power to the federal government, insisting states or private entities should handle them. Though comprehensive plans for roads and canals did not fully materialize under Jefferson, this question about federal versus state roles in improvements set the stage for later battles. Figures like Henry Clay would later champion a broader American system, which included federal financing for infrastructure, demonstrating how debates seeded in the Jefferson era echoed into subsequent administrations. Throughout these controversies, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, continued to set precedents for federal power. Marbury v. Madison, 1803, established judicial review, while McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, declared that states could not tax the federal bank. Federalists hailed these rulings as a legal backbone for national stability, whereas Democratic Republicans denounced them as undermining states' rights. Maryland's Attorney General Luther Martin criticized McCulloch in widely read pamphlets, and John Randolph of Roanoke argued in his essays that centralizing judicial power threatened individual liberties. Amid these domestic battles, John Quincy Adams, working abroad as a diplomat, observed how the Napoleonic Wars and British impressment of American sailors dictated international alliances, which in turn influenced which party gained momentum at home. Letters he sent to Washington described the difficulties of protecting mutual trade, and his eventual presidency would grapple with the legacies of both Federalist and Democratic Republican policies. This would influence the Monroe Doctrine, he wrote later. By the early 1820s, the country's direction was shaped by layers of conflict over law, commerce, territorial expansion, constitutional interpretation, and foreign relations. James Madison, who once collaborated with Hamilton on the Federalist Papers, drifted toward Jeffersonian ideals after witnessing the economic toll of trade restrictions and the burdens of war. Margaret Bayard Smith, a perceptive observer of Washington society, noted in her letters how these political questions permeated every aspect of daily life. Americans weighed decisions regarding alliances abroad, states' rights at home, and whether the future lay in agriculture or industry. From the midnight judges of the Judiciary Act of 1801 to the Barbary Wars, from the Louisiana Purchase to the ban on slave importation, from non-intercourse acts and Macon's Bill No. 2 to the Embargo Act, Tariff of 1816, and arguments over internal improvements, an array of policies defined the Jefferson era. Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, and John Quincy Adams all contributed distinct visions, balancing commerce against agriculture, a strong center against local autonomy, and isolation against engagement. Newspapers such as the Gazette of the United States and the Richmond Enquirer magnified each clash, forging a partisan press. Through documents, letters, and court rulings that survive today, it is evident that these intertwined policy debates left a lasting imprint on American politics, as the Republic grappled with its core identity and how to govern itself in a rapidly changing world.